Hello, everyone, and welcome to Carpet City Cinema, a Gila Films podcast. I'm David Weaver. Been a few weeks since we've done an episode. Just really busy over here in Amsterdam, New York, but finally going to get back to it now. Kind of had an idea for doing a series of episodes about a specific theme, and maybe kind of doing a variety of these series in the future. And we're going to kind of jump right into it pretty quickly. I did just want to touch on a few passings that happened. Right off the top, Barbara Rush, age 97, the golden age of cinema actress, leading lady in a number of acclaimed films. She, interesting, she kind of carved out different niches. She's known to science fiction fans for being in When Worlds Collide and It Came from Outer Space, which are two of the better loved entries in 1950s science fiction cinema at the very beginning of the decade. That, of course, is the golden age of science fiction decade that many people refer to. And When Worlds Collide came out in 1951, It Came from Outer Space, which was the first of several acclaimed science fiction films from director Jack Arnold. That came out in 1953. She's also known for her work with director Douglas Sirk. She collaborated with him 3 times. Probably best known for Magnificent Obsession, which was kind of one of the key films that kind of established the template that Sirk would be known for throughout the 50s, for these lush, beautiful color photography melodramas. And in that, Rush she was not the lead role. That was Jane Wyman and Rock Hudson were the leads, but she was a key supporting part. She was paired up with Frank Sinatra twice, so fans of the chairman of the board know her for Come Blow Your Horn and Robin and the Seven Hoods. She was with opposite Paul Newman also a pair of times for The Young Philadelphians and Ombre. Did a lot of TV work. She was on the Peyton Place soap. She was on Flamingo Road, and a much later generation knew her as the grandmother from Seventh Heaven, and guest starred in a lot of TV stuff too. I highly recommend checking out, especially if you're fans of genre stuff, her 1970s TV movie, The Eyes of Charles Sand, which is a movie that was attempted to launch a TV series. It didn't quite work, but it is a good film. And Warner Archive put it out on DVD, and she really goes the distance in her performance in that. Really, it's fearless, a fearless performance for sure. We also lost actor Ron Harper, age 91, who is best known for his small screen work, the TV shows in the 70s that he did, Planet of the Apes, the live action show with Roddy McDowall and James Naughton. He and Naughton were the 2 astronauts on the planet trying to escape the evil General Ursus. Was it Urkel? I can't remember who it was. I always forget which was the general's names. Whoever it was Spock's dad, Mark Leonard. And then also in that same decade, Harper was on Land of the Lost, the last of the 3 seasons. When Spencer Milligan left the show, Harper came on board to kind of be the adult figure for the kids in the Land of the Lost. But he was also on a lot of other shorter-lived shows in the 60s, like Garrison's Gorillas, 87th Precinct, based off the Ed McBain cop stories, Wendy and Me with George Burns. Did show up in some films as well, The Wild Season, the Poughkeepsie Tapes, Pearl Harbor, and Fred Olen Ray's Venomous. Sylvia Tortosa, age 77, a very familiar face to fans of Euro horror, probably best remembered for her work in Horror Express, the Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee flick, but she also showed up in The Lorelei's Grasp. She was in Jess Franco's Countdown to Esmeralda Bay, and Paul Naschy's The Frenchman's Garden. And last but certainly not least, we have actor Louis Gossett Jr., age 87, Academy Award winner, the first black actor to win the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for his performance in An Officer and a Gentleman. Just one of several awards he took home. He won the Emmy for his work in the original Roots miniseries. That was just one of 8 nominations he garnered. As recently as his work on the TV series of Watchmen, he received an Emmy nomination for that. But just an incredible career, incredible filmography, even way before Officer and Gentleman. He was raised in the Sun on stage and in the film version with Sidney Poitier. He was also in Hal Ashby's The Landlord, opposite James Garner in Skin Game. He was in The Deep and The White Dawn. Of course, as he became, his profile rose even more in the 80s. He was in Enemy Mine and the Iron Eagle franchise. And of course, all us fans of pre-MCU Marvel, he was with Dolph Lundgren in The Punisher. So, R.I.P. to Louis Gossett Jr. So, as I mentioned, thought it'd be cool to kind of do these different series of episodes, diving into kind of more specific themes. And one thing that kind of intrigued me that I have wanted to kind of do like a chronological viewing of is the works of a producer by the name of Samuel Bronston. Why? What's the story with this guy, and why is he so interesting? Bronston was a producer who was known for, well, his career lasted. He got into the film business in the 30s and was involved in it up until the 80s. But the time period for which he's best known is in the very late 50s and basically through the mid 60s, a series of big budgeted, high profile, epic historical films that he basically shot them all in Spain, and really was kind of played a key role in developing Spain as an international production hub. And what happened, though, of course, is these huge historical epics. At first, it started out good. They made some big money, but in kind of in the same fashion as the musicals at the time, where like you had movies like The Sound of Music and My Fair Lady, which did really well, and then of course everyone was making musicals, and then suddenly all these musicals started bombing. In much the same way, these historical epics that Bronston was behind, at first they got decent reviews and did really good money at the box office, but then they just started becoming very expensive flops. Even though some of the ones that didn't become profitable, they're still good films. And he had kind of this core group of directors and writers that he would often work with, and kind of interesting ways of getting his films produced. He got some financing, for example, from one of the DuPont family members, the DuPont Chemical Company. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at, basically a 5-episode look at kind of like these big key epic historical films. But first, let's kind of jump back and just do a quick look at his history. So Bronston, he was born in 1908. He was born in a part of the Russian Empire, which is now part of the country of Moldova now. But he was actually a nephew of Leon Trotsky, actually, believe it or not. But came to the U.S. in 1937 and kind of got his... he studied at the Sorbonne in France, but kind of got his feet wet in film, working for MGM's French unit in Paris at some point. But then into the 1940s, that's when he starts becoming involved as an independent producer himself. And the first film that he does is in 1942. It's The Adventures of Martin Eden, an adaptation of the Jack London novel Martin Eden. It starred Glenn Ford. It was distributed by Columbia. And then the following year, he forms his own independent production company, Samuel Bronston Productions. His next film is in 1943, that same year, Jack London, a biopic of the famed writer. No coincidence, since he had just adapted one of his works. And that was released by United Artists. And he also did a crime film he produced called City Without Men. Then in 1945, he gets approached by actor Burgess Meredith, future Mickey from the Rocky films of the Penguin, who encourages him to adapt a book, a World War II book novel called A Walk in the Sun by a guy named Harry Brown. And Bronston becomes really interested in it and starts developing the project. But at some point, basically, there becomes an issue with financing. And a different filmmaker, Louis Milestone, who was a really famous director. He had directed All Quiet on the Western Front and Of Mice and Men, Academy Award-winning filmmaker. He was able to somehow, I don't have all the details, but basically the funding became problematic for Bronston, and Milestone was basically able to step in and take over the production and make the film himself, and it ended up being distributed by Fox. So Bronston, although his name didn't end up on the credits, he was able to take legal action to at least get a significant amount of the money, the profits, the ticket sales, like something like it was like over 20% or something like that. So that film comes out in 1945. And then if you look at his filmography on IMDb, there's nothing from 1945 to 1959. And I found a couple obituaries on Bronston online, and it basically looks like he eventually went to work kind of around this time for the Catholic Church. He became the official photographer for the Vatican, and he ended up producing a number of short films on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church. So then we go into the 1950s, and we start approaching kind of like the first of these historical films. Now, there are 6 films that can kind of qualify as these historical epics that he produced, and they are in order of release date. John Paul Jones, 1959, King of Kings, 1961, El Cid, 1961, 55 Days at Peking, 1963, The Fall of the Roman Empire, which came out in 1964, and Circus World, which came out in 1964. Now, we'll kind of discuss John Paul Jones because it kind of kicks off this whole cycle. We're not going to kind of do a whole episode on that. I have not seen that film, and I do want to because I'm a big fan, as I mentioned when we talked about 1776, of films dealing with the American Revolution. But because of that, I kind of want to wait to watch that movie closer to the 4th of July because I'm a holiday freak like that. And also, even though it definitely kicks off this whole era of Bronston's career, I've never kind of, and maybe this is totally my own naivete, I've never really viewed this movie in the same light as the subsequent ones because they were just a little, they were bigger and they had kind of like a little bit more flavor of like an all-star cast. Whereas John Paul Jones, I always kind of got the impression that was just more laying the groundwork for what was to come. I could be wrong, and I'll definitely do a recap on it when I watch it, which I'll definitely make sure to watch it this summer. But, we'll talk about the kind of history of it just because it does lead into these other films. So Bronston had expressed interest in making a film about the life of John Paul Jones, which, for those of you who are not familiar with him, he is, of course, the famous naval figure on the American side during the Revolutionary War. I have not yet begun to fight was his famous quote. But Bronston, as early as 1946, was looking to make a film about this guy's life. And it wasn't until late 1955, December 1955, that he mentioned he had formed a new production company, Admiralty Pictures Corporation, and a bunch of New York investors, and they were going to make this movie. And it's interesting because he received investment from a number of businesses and business people into his film production company, including members of the Rockefeller family and, like I've said before, the DuPont family, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, General Motors, Eastman Kodak. And this kind of would foreshadow not only how his productions would be made in the future, but also some of the problems he would run into. So the film of John Paul Jones, it actually didn't go before the cameras until January 1958. That's when it actually got rolling. There was some different back and forth about directors and writers and actors, but in the end, filming started in January 1958. Robert Stack, who of course we all in this of my era know him from Unsolved Mysteries, but of course, prior to that was Elliot Ness on The Untouchables and was an Academy Award nominated actor. A lot of people don't know for Written on the Wind, and even going back further into the 40s was opposite Deanna Durbin in a couple films and was in such acclaimed movies as The Mortal Storm and To Be or Not to Be. So just an incredible career. He was cast finally in the role of John Paul Jones, and directing the film would be John Farrow. You might know him as Mia Farrow's and Tisa Farrow's dad, but he was also a very famous old school Hollywood director. He had done such acclaimed films as The Big Clock, which is one of the best of the noirish movies ever made. He had received the Best Director Oscar nomination for Wake Island, which was one of the first American films made after our entry into World War II, about World War II. Also did a really great movie I highly recommend called His Kind of Woman, which was kind of a satire of the film noir types. And he did a couple movies with John Wayne, most notably Hondo. And this John Paul Jones would actually be the last film he would end up directing. But he ended up going, like I said, going before the cameras January 1958, and they ended up filming in France initially, and then moving over to Spain, including shooting scenes in the Royal Palace in Madrid. Now, the film was a box office failure. It had a budget of $5 million, and remember that's $5 million in 1959 money, and it only brought in North America, like U.S. Canada, only brought in $1 million. So not good at all. However, like I said, he's shooting in Spain. He's doing a historical epic. He's getting financing for his movies from businesses and industries. So this is kind of like the formula that's going to kind of come to play in the films that are coming up, the films that we're going to really do deeper dives into. And perhaps most importantly about John Paul Jones, John Baldwin, bassist of Led Zeppelin, the reason he took the stage name John Paul Jones is it was suggested to him by a guy who had seen this movie's poster. So that could perhaps be the longest lasting cultural legacy of this film. So that brings us to the first of the movies that we're really going to kind of take a closer look at, and that is King of Kings from 1961. And this is kind of one of the reasons I wanted to do this dive into Bronston's career now, is because it was Easter time. I was like, I haven't seen King of Kings in like 25 years. I saw it as like a teenager. I borrowed my aunt and uncle's two-tape cassette, not widescreen. My aunt's a big fan of this film, and it's directed by Nicholas Ray, who, of course, is a phenomenal filmmaker, did Rebel Without a Cause, Johnny Guitar, They Live by Night, and a much different type of film for him, perhaps, because it is this huge epic, historical epic, whereas he was best known for his smaller work, more, very intimate, more intimate works. And so with Easter, I was like, you know what, I really want to kind of watch this movie again. I haven't seen it forever, and this would be a good way to kind of kick off this whole Bronston deep dive. So I did watch King of Kings. I watched it. I think I watched it Easter night. Yeah, after we got home from dinner. But before I dive into my thoughts on that movie, just kind of want to look at how this film got going, because it does connect to John Paul Jones's director, John Farrow, who's kind of the originator of the project. So John Farrow had been interested in making a movie about the life of Christ way before he ever teamed up with Bronston, back as early as February of 1951, which was then a report circulating that Farrow wanted to do a movie on the life of Christ, that he had a script titled Son of Man, and he wanted to produce it independently, lower budgeted for under $800,000. And later that year, in November, it was reported that the film was still under development, and that Farrow was starting to look for actors, and that he was going to shoot it at the Nassau Studios, which was a lower budgeted outfit. So that's November 51. But by August 53, Farrow, he signs on to direct a movie with John Wayne called The Sea Chase. They had already done Hondo together, and this would be their second and final collaboration. And so he signs on in 53 to direct that. He films it in 54. It would eventually be released in 55. But in 54, there was reports in the LA Times that Farrow would probably begin development on Son of Man after completion on The Sea Chase. But then things got delayed again, because in about mid 55, April 55, Farrow signs on to direct Around the World in 80 Days, which of course is the big budget, star-studded film adaptation of Jules Verne's novel starring David Niven. However, Farrow would be fired from that film after less than a week of shooting. Apparently, Michael Todd, who was producing the movie, of course, famed for the Todd A.O. process, the husband of Elizabeth Taylor at the time. He apparently was unsatisfied with the work Farrow was turning in, and had him replaced with Michael Anderson, the famed British director. Farrow did retain a co-screenwriting credit on the film, and so when the movie was released, he did earn share in the Best Screenplay nomination of the movie, which went on to win Best Picture for that year when it came out in 56. So January 56, Farrow's no longer on Around the World, and then Variety reports that he was talking with RKO to get Son of Man off the ground. And a couple months later, he was again searching for an actor to play the role of Christ. But then in 57, October of that year, he signs on to do John Paul Jones, as we discussed. So after John Paul Jones, Farrell and Bronston decided to form their own production company, Brofar, and planned to do this Son of Man script. And reports were coming out in November '58, for example, that they were going to work on a project on the life of Christ. There were reports in about 6 months later, May '59, that the script was being worked on. However, by October of '59, Farrell was gone, and that ended his involvement with the film. Now, Farrow stated, and it was supposedly over creative differences, but Farrow's take on, and this is a quote from him. Well, he says that Samuel Bronston, wanted him to, quote, whitewash the Jewish leaders and lay blame entirely on the Romans. I refuse to make these changes. I quit. So that was his take on it. The associate producer on the film, Alan Brown, said, quote, that the script was not really a script. It was the four gospels put down, and Sam called me and said, I cannot even understand this. It's all thee and thou and everything else. But either way, Farrell was gone for the project and would die at a pretty young age. Just a few years later, 1963, died of a heart attack. He was 58 years old. And yeah, no more directorial roles from him after John Paul Jones. So Farrell's gone in October '59. November, Nicholas Ray signs on to direct the project. So again, Nicholas Ray, huge, incredible filmography. Like I said, They Live by Night, In a Lonely Place, Johnny Guitar, Rebel Without a Cause, Bitter Victory, Bigger Than Life. Known, of course, for these very strong character pieces, very intimate, dealing with a lot of angst, not just the teen angst of Rebel Without a Cause, but of course all the inner turmoil going on in a film like Johnny Guitar, or even the films noir he did. He, of course, is very adept at shooting in black and white, as you can see in some of those earlier films. I should also mention On Dangerous Ground, an excellent film noir he did with Robert Ryan and Eddie Lupino, but also known for his great use of color in films like Rebel and Johnny Guitar. So he comes on, like I said, a month after Farrow's departure. And the thing is, by the time Ray's brought on, they're almost done building the sets. Like, they're working on this, getting like the framework of production going. Bronston's putting that money to use. So Nicholas Ray asked Philip Jordan, who was a screenwriter, Academy Award winner, and who had worked on Johnny Guitar. He asked him to come in and rewrite the script. And Jordan was kind of reluctant to go to Spain. He didn't really want to do it, but he ended up going over there and rewriting the script in about 6 weeks' time. He's the one who suggested they change the title to King of Kings, and there was some concern about that because Cecil B. DeMille, the legendary Cecil B. DeMille, who also was very, very well known for his historical and often biblical epics. He had directed a film about Christ's life in 1927 called The King of Kings. This film was not a remake of that one, but the titles were similar. But Jordan actually found out that, first he was like, well, it's a public domain title. But then he found out that DeMille had never registered the title of the original film. So Jordan quickly registered King of Kings with the MPAA and then wrote a new script in 6 weeks. And Samuel Bronston liked the script so much that he's like, yeah, just stay here. Stay in Madrid. And so Jordan would become kind of a key part of some of these other films that we're going to get into and talk about. Interesting thing about Jordan, though, he's known as this, of course, Academy Award-winning writer. He won the Best Story Oscar for the Western Broken Lance, which was basically a Western take on King Lear. He had also been nominated for Dillinger, the biopic of the criminal that came out in the mid-'40s, and for William Wyler's detective story. His name is on so many scripts throughout the 1950s and 60s. The thing about Jordan, though, is that he was someone who would often employ blacklisted writers. And if you ever get a chance, Bernard Gordon, who was one of the blacklisted writers during the communist witch hunt era, he was someone who collaborated with, worked a lot with Jordan. And he wrote an amazing book called Hollywood Exile, or How I Learned to Love the Blacklist. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. It's like one of those books that's just so well written. I mean, he was a screenwriter, of course. And Gordon himself, we're going to talk about him in the future episodes because he would become involved with Bronston. But you read Gordon's book on his own work and his work with Philip Jordan, and you read some of the other stuff about Philip Jordan. It's kind of it becomes eventually questionable how much Jordan actually wrote of the films he's credited with, and how much of it was just him using his name to front for blacklisted writers. Gordon was of the opinion, Bernard Gordon was of the opinion that Phil Jordan was a talented writer and definitely did have writing abilities, but at the same time, he would kind of like use a lot of these other guys and just be the front during the whole blacklist era. So I say that I don't have any specific insight as to whether I'm not saying that he isn't responsible for the final product of King of Kings, that screenplay, but it's something to keep in mind. Whenever I see his name on a film, I'm kind of like, well, did he actually write this movie, or is he just hiring someone else, paying them out of his salary to turn in the script? Now, in terms of in front of the camera, casting on this, the role of Christ would go to Jeffrey Hunter. Now, I don't know how accurate this is. I guess there are rumors that like Christopher Plummer was in the running as for Jesus, which would make sense because Nicholas Ray had directed Christopher Plummer in a movie called Wind Across the Everglades just prior to this. And Max von Sydow was someone who was also considered. He would of course play Christ in The Greatest Story Ever Told, which came out a few years later. Apparently, early on in the whole process, Alec Guinness was actually in talks to play the role, which was kind of weird. He would have been. I feel like he just would have been too old, and that I don't know. That just doesn't sound like that would have been a good idea. Although he's a phenomenal actor, of course. But Jeffrey Hunter ended up with it, and that came about because John Ford had directed Hunter in The Searchers, and he recommended Hunter to Nicholas Ray, and Nicholas Ray, by coincidence, had also worked with Jeffrey Hunter in the movie The True Story of Jesse James, which Ray directed. Hunter had played Frank James, and so Bronston weighed in on it, and his whole take on it was, and this is a quote of his: "I really chose him for his eyes. It was important that the man playing Christ have memorable eyes." Well, hey, if the eyes is what gets you, why not? But that's what kind of led to Hunter getting the role. Some interesting little tidbits. Grace Kelly was approached to play Mary, Mother of Jesus. This is the point in which she had entered into her non-acting phase of her life after marrying Prince Rainier of Monaco, and she ended up turning down the role, which went to Siobhan McKenna. There's a key role in the film of a centurion named Lucius, which we'll get into. And Richard Burton was supposed to play that part, and eventually dropped out of the project because of disputes over billing. He wanted to have a much higher billing in the film. And Pontius Pilate they considered James Mason for that part, which James Mason is an incredible actor. That would have been awesome. But for whatever reason, he didn't take on the role, and it went to Hurd Hatfield, who also is a good actor and is probably one of the most memorable performances in the film. So to fund this beast, Bronston had it independently financed, and kind of again followed that same playbook he had done before with John Paul Jones. He got some financing from a Venezuelan oil company, and he went over to his buddy Pierre Dupont of the Dupont family to pony up some cash. The budget on this thing was cited back in contemporary sources, the LA Times, as $6 million. So you're $1 million over John Paul Jones. And apparently DuPont's contribution was over 1.3 million. So that's, more than 1/6 of the budget came from this one guy. And it's crazy if you look at these, this is the deal that DuPont had in exchange for financing this movie. DuPont would receive 92% of the partnership profits, up to $1.5 million. And then after that, he would get 85% of profits in excess of that amount. Which I guess the first part makes sense because, he's putting in all 1.4. He's going to want most of the money coming in until he gets his money back. But I don't know, maybe that's a typical deal. I don't know. It's just like he's getting a lot of money. Well, hey, more power to him. But apparently the budget ballooned. They had originally said it was going to be $6 million, and by by October of 60, they were up to 8.5 million. The Variety was reporting. A couple months later, the LA Times said, well, now they got it in for 7.5. But it sounds like it definitely went over budget, which was a big movie, of course. Yeah, and following again on that playbook, they were shooting in Spain, shooting the film in Spain, following that John Paul Jones roadmap. So, filming on the movie, principal photography began in 1960. In It was in April of that year, and as they were filming, by June, MGM had their curiosity piqued about this film. They had, of course, had a lot of success with the biblical epic Ben Hur, which came out in 1959, swept the Academy Awards, won 11 Oscars, a record which has been equaled twice but never surpassed. And so they were like, they basically came over and were like, we'd like to distribute this and really turn it into a big like roadshow event and kind of have Ben Hur 2.0 on our hands. Now the thing about MGM getting involved is their head of production came over to the to the film set, to the film location, and made some suggestions that he felt needed to happen. He felt that the film was too long. He felt that it needed more action. He felt that the ending was weak, and so they. One of the responses they did is they created a new character, original character, not someone from the Bible, named David, and had cast Richard Johnson, the British actor, who around this time was married to Kim Novak, in this role of this character of David, and he was there to kind of serve as as the connective tissue between all the film's different plot threads. Um, and all these kind of changes in what was going on with the script that kind of led to some problems between Nick Ray and Phil Jordan. It's interesting to have such kind of changes. I mean, it's not. I mean, you hear about it now. There's examples of like Men in Black 3 shutting down because they only had 2/3 of a script, and so they shut down after filming 2/3. Or a movie like World War Z, where it's a big budget movie where they had to basically reshoot huge chunks of that movie. So it's not unheard of, but it's just kind of like it always just amazes me when even like these big budget films, big name stars, directors, actors, everything, that they're still making these huge changes midstream that are just having a colossal impact on just the entire machinations of it all, just the entire the mechanics. It's just crazy to think of like you're filming this huge historical epic, you're already shooting it for a couple months, and then someone's like, yeah, we're gonna give you even more money, but can you put a whole new major character into this film that will change the structure? Please make that happen. But filming continued, and it definitely took its toll on things. There was in September of 1960, there was an automobile accident, and one of the horse trainers on the film was killed, and one of the actors, Harry Gardino, who plays Barabbas in the film, he was injured. And Ray, he was just like so overwhelmed. Ray had a history of like some emotional and mental health issues that he kind of struggled with from time to time. And I don't know to what factor this played in, but he did have to kind of temporarily step back from the film just to kind of get things. Maintain movement while he was gone. Charles Walters stepped in to kind of do a little bit of directing. Charles Walters is a very well-known director, not for this type of film. He was known for musicals, Academy Award nominee himself. But finally, they wrapped up filming in October of that year. So 6 months, 6 months shoot from April to October. So now they headed to post-production on the movie. And what's one of the first decisions they make in post-production? All that stuff that they filmed with Richard Johnson as this new character of David, goodbye. Totally cut. Absolutely gone. He's no longer in the movie. I'm really glad they made that decision to create that chaos. They as with any film, they did some reshoots, shot some new scenes. Ray Bradbury, actually, of course, the legendary science fiction author, but who had also worked on screenplays prior to this. He had wrote the script for John Huston's Moby Dick. He was brought in to kind of punch up the ending, and also he was the guy who was there to write the narration that you hear throughout the film, which would be provided by the voice of the wonderful Orson Welles. Finally, all said and done, October 11th, 1961, the film premieres in the U.S., Runtime of over 2.5 hours, 160 minutes, and that's not counting the overture and intermission and all that stuff. The film ended up being profitable. It brought in $13.4 million altogether. So not a runaway success, but it definitely did do well. And no Oscar nominations, but it did get a Golden Globe nom for the music score by, and I'm probably butchering his name, Miklos Rocha, the famed multi-Academy Award-winning composer. Reviews, I was looking at contemporary reviews of the film. I can't really get a real consensus of it. This person likes it, this person doesn't. But I do want to kind of, point out a couple specific reviews because they kind of echoed my thoughts on the film. But before we get too far into the weeds on that, one thing I was thinking about was that I grew up in a religious household, so the whole story of Jesus is something I'm very familiar with, but my girlfriend, for example, who did not grow up in such an environment, was kind of, not familiar with a lot of it. So I think we should do a quick recap on the story of Jesus, since that is the narrative of this film, because not everyone is as familiar with it. It's basically the same as going over the plot of the film. So the classics illustrated take on it would be that you have the Bible, of course, a collection of 66 different books all put together in one, which is the religious text of the Christian faith, and divided into an Old Testament and a New Testament. And the first 4 books of the New Testament are called the Gospels, named after their authors. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of those tells the life of Jesus from a different perspective. And so the idea in the Old Testament is that it was foretold that a Messiah, a deliverer, a savior would come to rescue the Jewish people who were God's chosen people. And in the New Testament, the idea, of course, is that Jesus is that Messiah and that he came to save people spiritually from the consequences of their sins. He was born of this virgin birth to Mary, who was engaged to a carpenter named Joseph. He was God in human form, God taking on the form of man. And of course, the nativity story, most people are familiar with that, well established by everyone from Linus in A Charlie Brown Christmas to a sundry Rankin Bass specials. And then for the kind of like the youth and the teens and 20s of Jesus, there's not really much in the Bible about that, just a little mentions here and there. But then he starts his ministry at age 30. And so right before he starts his ministry, his coming is kind of foretold by this prophet named John the Baptist, who is kind of a key figure in King of Kings, the movie, played by the great Robert Ryan. And so he begins his ministry at age 30, and he ministers for 3 years. And he has these 12 disciples or apostles who are basically aiding him in this endeavor. And he's, preaching basically philosophies about love and forgiveness. He's preaching about the true nature of God. He's working miracles, healing the sick, raising the dead. Well, at least one, Lazarus. But the established Judaic leaders of the time were not happy with what he was doing. They thought him to be a fake, and they were concerned that he was going to rile up the people in a way that would cause problems between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire, which at that time had conquered Israel, and who were represented in this area by Pontius Pilate. And part of the problem with this was that Jesus, he was coming as this spiritual deliverer, but a lot of the people, they interpreted the idea of a Messiah as someone who would literally save the Jewish people and overthrow the Roman Empire. So they were thinking that, he's going to actually rescue us from the Roman overlords. And so that kind of was in the background of the concerns that the religious leaders had. So, so he goes about doing this. He's gaining popularity. It's about 3 years in. Kind of culminates with him riding into Jerusalem on what we now call Palm Sunday. And at this point, it's becoming, an untenable situation for the religious leaders. So they basically team up with one of his disciples, Judas, who betrays Jesus to them, and he's basically moved back and forth between the religious leaders, between Pilate, between uh, King Herod Antipas, who was basically this puppet king that the Romans had installed, and each one is it's kind of like this. No one. It's like hot potato. No one wants hot Messiah. No one wants him because no one wants to take the responsibility for trying this person and setting him to death because they know he's essentially guiltless. He hasn't actually committed a crime. He's preaching all this stuff about love and tolerance and peace, and the people are getting riled up. But he's not actually doing anything to rile them up, and so he actually hasn't done anything wrong or illegal. Yet at the same time, the religious leaders want rid of him, and the Pilate wants to just keep the peace at all costs. So it's kind of like moving him back and forth between them because no one wants to basically be the bad cop in the good cop bad cop situation. They all want to they want the situation ended, but no one wants to be the one to actually have to pull the trigger. And so that finally gets to the point where it's this holiday, a Jewish holiday, and there's a custom where one man can be freed, one prisoner can be freed on this holiday, and Pilate thinks this is a way to kind of get around things. He'll put Jesus out to these people and ask them if they want him freed, and they'll ask for that, and that will kind of end this whole situation. Now he's done what he had to do by taking Jesus into custody, but then it was the will of the people to let him go. But when he puts Jesus before the people, he puts him along with a criminal named Barabbas, who also becomes a key part in the movie King of Kings. And the people end up choosing Barabbas as the one that they want freed. So basically, Jesus' fate is sealed. He is executed on the cross. He is buried in a tomb, and 3 days later, the tomb is found to be empty. He has risen from the dead. He presents himself to his followers. He continues to preach for like 40 days, and then he ascends to heaven. So that is the Jesus story in a nutshell that King of Kings essentially covers. It kind of cuts off at the end right to his appearance to the disciples after his resurrection. It doesn't really go too much into the 40 days after that. So, with all that in mind, what did I think of the film? It's a film that obviously it's competently made. There's no denying that. But it is a movie that I have lots of small different problems with it. A host of not minor problems, but they're also not like blaring problems either. Like there is no for the most part, there is no really bad performance in this film. There is no egregious error or mistake in and of itself that kind of sinks the whole thing. But there's a lot of serious and noteworthy issues I take with it. And at the same time as I say that, there's nothing on the flip side, there's nothing about the film really that rises to the level of greatness. And even to the level of like, oh, that was really good. One of the reviewers of this film back when it came out, this was in a publication called the Monthly Film Bulletin. This is what they had to say on it, and I definitely feel for this review. Quote, "The overwhelming failure, though, is in finding any kind of style in imagery, dialogue, or music, which goes beyond the most insipidly conventional kind of Bible illustrations," end quote. So I think that's a little too harsh, but I think it kind of speaks to a huge problem with the film, which is that this film never comes alive. It never feels like anything more than the most straightforward retelling of the facts that are in the Bible. And part of that could be laid at the choosing of Nicholas Ray as director, because this is just something that's, I'm not saying that he's not capable of taking on this kind of material, but it's just so outside what he normally did. And I'm sure there are people who would argue differently, who would say, look at his films. Look at movies like They Live by Night. Look at movies like Johnny Guitar, and look at Rebel Without a Cause. These central characters of these movies are people who do not fit in with the mainstream thought. James Dean does not fit in with either his parents in Rebel Without a Cause, nor with the teenagers at the new school that he's at. They Live by Night. It's a very similar tone, and except it's about criminals, young criminals in love on the run, constantly obviously out of place with acceptable behavior in society. Johnny Guitar is all about Joan Crawford's character, who wants to run this saloon and this business in the town, and this other woman, Mercedes McCambridge, wants nothing to do with her, and it's a whole allegory about the communist witch hunts. So the topic matter is definitely something that Ray's familiar with, because Jesus essentially fits into that same mold as someone who is very much out of favor, out of touch with a lot of mainstream thought and people in power at the time. But for whatever reason, he does not in this film harness that that material and those kind of themes to good effect. And is it just because of his own personal issues at the time that he was dealing with? Is it because of the period nature of the piece? And I think the script definitely is also bears blame for this as well, especially in the presentation of Jesus. Almost all of his dialogue in this movie, Jeffrey Hunter's dialogue as Jesus, is Bible quotes. It's like, and it's such a difference when his character talks versus other characters. There's a lot of scenes in the film between Barabbas, who we mentioned, and Judas. So I should say real quick that one of the things that this film puts forth, because in the Bible it talks about how Judas betrays Jesus and he's paid for it. It doesn't really go into depth about it, so it could leave you with the impression that he just did it for money. It doesn't really get too much into the psychology of it. And what this film puts forth is the idea that and I should also say at the same time, before I get too further, is that in the Bible, Barabbas, there's not a lot of detail given about him either, other than that he's this prisoner who's like facing a death sentence, notorious prisoner. So in this movie, they put forth the idea that Barabbas is actually the leader of a group of rebels, insurgents against the Roman Empire, and he's played by Harry Gardino, and that Judas is one of his men, and that Judas gets finds the teachings of Christ appealing, his call for peace, and really believes that Jesus might have a way of bringing down the Roman Empire on his own, and they shouldn't necessarily resort to the more violent tactics of Barabbas. Barabbas, on the other hand, in the film, he's basically of the thought that talk's cheap and action speaks louder than words, and so Judas finally in betraying Jesus, his real motivation is actually he thinks that if Jesus is faced with execution, is faced with death, that he will reveal his powers and overthrow the Roman Empire in that moment. And that's his whole motivation for doing it. So there's a lot of scenes in the film with Barabbas and Judas interacting with each other and having these kind of philosophical talks. There's also a lot of scenes in the film between Pontius Pilate, essentially a Roman governor of Judea. He's played by Herb Hatfield in the film, best known as playing the title character in the 1940s horror classic, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And there's a lot of scenes where he's discussing things with this specific Roman centurion played by Ron Randall, named Lucius. And those scenes feel much more natural and free-flowing and organic in terms of their dialogue and just the ebb and flow of everything. But then you get to any time that Jeffrey Hunter speaks as Christ, and it just feels like, again, kind of like it just feels like so cookie cutter cliche, because it's just Bible verses. There's no attempt to kind of like mold those into some type of more acceptable language, more commonplace language. And the thing we got to remember, of course, about Bible verses is they're translated from this ancient text, and then in the King James version, which was one of the most popular forms translations of the Bible, they were translated into like this ancient English vocabulary. And so it would have been nice if they had kind of taken all those words that they put into Jesus' mouth in this film and really kind of massaged them into just more like normal speaking English. They tried to a degree, but not really that much. And there's a couple. In fact, actually, probably the most impactful scene in this movie that involves Jesus is when he knows he's going into Jerusalem and he's going to die eventually, in the upcoming week, and he's at at Mary's house, his mother Mary's house, and he's working on a chair and he realizes he has to leave, and he says to her, the chair will have to wait until I come back. And she says, "You're not coming back. I'm going to go with you." And it was kind of a very small part of the movie, but also probably, like I said, the most impactful part because it showed like, oh yeah, this guy grew up as the son of a carpenter, so he would be fixing the furniture in the house. That's what he did for a trade, and um, and it was just kind of like one of the most naturalistic scenes that he has in the movie. And of course, we're talking, if this was like a secondary character, it wouldn't matter so much, these kind of issues. But this is literally the title character of the film, your main character. And not only that, but there's just sections of the film where Jesus almost seems like an afterthought. There is really a lot of time spent with the whole subplot of Barabbas in his insurgency, of his talks with Judas, of the centurion Lucius, and his kind of exploration of the character of Jesus and his slow realization that maybe Jesus really is this Messiah. Interactions with, like I said, Pontius Pilate and Pontius Pilate's wife, Claudia, who is played by the great Vivica Lindfors, um, and her kind of also kind of starting to become a believer in Jesus. There's a lot of time spent on that stuff, which it's a 3-hour movie, so I would expect there's a lot of material to be covered, and there's definitely plenty of room to deviate from just focusing on Christ to kind of give the whole scope of his story. But it does it to such a degree that, combined with the fact that every time Jesus speaks, he just feels like it's Xeroxing something out of the Bible, it just makes it feel like Jesus is almost like secondary to the narrative. It's almost like you're watching a film more about people's reactions to Jesus than Jesus himself, and that's not wrong to take that approach in and of itself. But I don't feel like that was their approach. Like I feel like that was a byproduct of choices they made and not a deliberate a decision. I think that, and so it comes across with a sense of awkwardness to it, especially when you do have these scenes where you are fully focused on Jesus, like his temptation in the desert, or maybe the Sermon on the Mount. But then you have these stretches where he's kind of almost like an afterthought, and all this, everything I'm talking about, whether it's his unnatural speech or, like I said, just cut and paste of Bible text, or the fact that he almost seems, to be in the background a lot of times, all of this works together to just kind of make the character of Jesus seem artificial and not human. And the whole idea is that he's supposed to be God in human form. So yeah, he's this guy who's supposed to be without sin, and he can work miracles and all this, but he's also supposed to be a human being with emotions and feelings, and he's not supposed to come across like something unworldly, which is a problem with a lot of films that tackle the life of Christ, is because they're so reverential that they don't, they forget the humanity, and he comes across like an alien. And when they made King of Kings, they really wanted to not achieve that. They really wanted to kind of humanize him more, but to me, it doesn't work at all. And as for Hunter himself as Christ, I don't think that. I think that a lot of the stuff we talked about obviously is going to be a hindrance to his performance, such as the type of dialogue he's given. And again, it's not a bad performance, but in the end, I just found my takeaway on it was that, like so many other performances in this film, it just was unmemorable. And Hunter is someone who kind of can definitely deliver the goods. I actually think that one of my favorite performances of his is in Star Trek, when he was originally, as you may or may not know, he was the original lead on the original Star Trek show, and they shot a pilot, and he played a captain of the Enterprise named Christopher Pike, and he did not end up signing up for the full series, and William Shatner was given the role of Kirk. And it's a very interesting character and performance that he gives in that. It was really effective. So he definitely had acting chops, but you're just you walk away from the film, you're just like, yeah, whatever. And honestly, I think the best performances, the ones that rise the most, kind of like I said, I think Herd Hatfield as Pontius Pilate. I think Vivica Lindfors as his wife Claudia. Frank Thring, the wonderful Australian character actor who plays King Herod Antipas. He brings a lot of he definitely brings a nice spice of flavor to his performance. An actor known for his flamboyant takes. Also, in a much smaller time on screen is, and I could probably totally butchering his name, is Gregoire Aslan, who plays Herod the Great, which is Herod Antipas's father. who's the king, the puppet king, basically, when Jesus is born. Those are all some of the better performances, and also Harry Gardino actually as Barabbas. Although obviously he has his Brooklyn accent, which it's not like when Tony Curtis was put in a period piece, as he was occasionally. It's not that extreme, but it's a little bit of a sore thumb. But I think that he kind of, I almost think that he could probably, him and Thring probably vie for the best performances in the film. I think the film suffers from the classic Jesus film miscasting of Mary, of someone who's too old, because the idea is that like Mary is supposed to be, uh, very young when she gets weds to Joseph, and they in the role they originally wanted Grace Kelly, of course, and they ended up getting Siobhan McKenna, who again not a bad actress or anything like that by any means. It's not a comment on her performance, but she's almost 40 when we see her at the beginning of the film, and then we're with her for 30 years. So to me, it's just a bit of miscasting. I think Franco Zeffirelli had the right idea when he put Olivia Hussey in the role in Jesus of Nazareth, the miniseries, because like that's kind of like more the idea of where she'd be age wise. It kind of reminds me of like The Greatest Story Ever Told, which I want to kind of revisit now after seeing this. They had Dorothy McGuire as Mary, who was like 50 years old at that point. And again, I love Dorothy McGuire, Swiss Family Robinson, all day, all night. But yeah, it's just kind of not bad casting. And then the character of John the Baptist. So I wanted to kind of talk about that a little. Robert Ryan, of course, is a legendary and great actor. And he had worked with Nicholas Ray beforehand. He had been in On Dangerous Ground, a great film noir. He had been in Flying Leathernecks. So they definitely had a working relationship. If you want to get strict, like we were kind of talking about with Mary, I think it stands a little bit out more with the character of Mary, that when you cast someone who's too old in the role, because we actually see her essentially at the beginning of the story giving birth to this kid. And I guess we can give the film a pass because it doesn't really go into this, but in the Bible, actually, something that is touched on, which is not touched on in this movie, is that John the Baptist, who is this, like I said, he was this prophet who foretold the coming of Christ. And then when Christ began his ministry, when Jesus began his whole work, John the Baptist baptized him. And eventually what happened with John the Baptist is that, as with Jesus, he was considered a troublemaker by the religious leaders. He aggravated King Herod Antipas because John the Baptist would call out the king's immoral behavior, and eventually Herod had him arrested and imprisoned. And the famous story, of course, he didn't want to. He had him arrested, but he really didn't want to do anything with him once he was arrested. He didn't want to have to execute him or anything like that, because he had reluctance about that. But of course, the famous story in the Bible is that his stepdaughter Salome danced for him, and she danced for him in return for him granting any favor she asked of. And what she asked of was for John the Baptist's head on a silver platter, because he had been essentially attacking. One of the things that John the Baptist attacked in terms of immorality was the fact that Herod Antipas had married his dead brother's wife, and it was kind of like this inappropriate relationship thing going on. And so Salome wanted to avenge her mother's honor. And so John the Baptist was executed. But in the Bible, John the Baptist actually is Jesus' cousin. So they're actually related, and they're born very close to each other. Now, the film doesn't touch on that, so the fact that Robert Ryan is much older than Jeffrey Hunter is not really an issue, because the film chooses not to take on that aspect of the narrative. So I don't think you should fault it for that. I think the bigger issue with that is why not? Why not deal with the fact that I think that's very important, that it's not just a prophet and the religious leader whose coming is foretold. It's also their blood, and they would have ideally, you can imagine, they would have grown up together and played together as kids and had this whole relationship. It's something that I think should have been explored a lot more in a lot of the adaptations of Jesus' life. Is his relationship with John the Baptist as more than just prophet and religious leader. And John the Baptist was kind of looked at as a little bit of a wild man, because he lived out in the desert, and he dressed in like animal skins, and he was kind of basically a proto hippie almost. And in the film King of Kings, of course, once he gets arrested and imprisoned, Jesus is able to see him while he's in prison and essentially give him his blessing. And he's upset about you can tell that obviously there's a sadness about what's going to happen to John the Baptist, but I think it would have just been a lot more layered and a lot more rich to kind of get into that that familial relationship because it brings so many more layers to the story. Now, going back to Robert Ryan being in that role again, I think Robert Ryan's a great actor, but I just it's kind of like Jeffrey Hunter as Jesus. It just comes across as um, unmemorable. It's not something that you walk away with. It's like, oh well, at least it had that one really, at least Robert Ryan nailed it as John the Baptist. It's kind of like a lower energy performance too from Robert Ryan in the role. It's very kind of reserved, especially for a character who was supposed to be so aggressive in his beliefs. And it almost seems like a deliberate choice because Ryan, if you watch his body of work and also if you just read about him, he was not an actor who phoned it in. Who he was someone who was very passionate about his craft. So I don't know if it was just a deliberate choice on his part to go that route. I would say an ineffectual choice, but hey, who am I to judge? And visually, again, Ray was someone who's he directed excellent black and white movies, but also given color palettes, amazing work. I mean, Johnny Guitar and Rebel the Cause, again, going back to those, two of his best known films, just great use of color. And you see that kind of come up occasionally in King of Kings, especially with the use of the color red, which is something that pops up in a lot of those other two films. But it is definitely not a very dynamic film visually. There is some nice use of depth of focus and I where he excels the most, he has some really nice overhead shots. I think there's the whole spoiler alert for if you're not familiar with the Bible, the whole scene depicting the death of the older King Herod the Great, the king who, like I said, he was in charge when Jesus was born and who tried to have Jesus murdered as a child. He eventually dies, and the whole handling of that is one of the best scenes visually in the film. It's also some nice, like more unusual for its time, like when they put Jesus on the cross and they raise the cross, they attach the camera to the top of the cross, pointing down, so like it rides up with Jesus, which is something that I would expect to see now, and it's much more familiar now, but at that time was definitely something that kind of stood out. So there's some occasional touches like that are really nice, but overall, it doesn't have the stamp of a visionary director, which is what Ray was, And I know a lot of people like the visuals in the film. Obviously, that review I read earlier didn't, but I know a lot of people. A lot of people put this up as one of the best of the biblical movies following on Christ's life. But to me, it really didn't come across that much more striking, oftentimes, than basically like a mid-grade budgeted sword and sandal film. I'm not talking like some super low budget thing, but it just really didn't stand heads and shoulders above a B plus budgeted production. I felt, and I'm just curious again. Like I said, I know Ray was going through a lot of emotional stuff at this time, and this was kind of. He would do this film, and then he would do 55 Days at Peking with Samuel Bronston, which we'll be covering soon. And I know that he went through a lot of turmoil personally on the film during the filming of that because they had to bring in two different directors at times to pinch hit. And I'm definitely curious to kind of because I've never seen that film before. Once I get to that, to kind of see what stands out about that. But maybe he just wasn't on his game at this point. Maybe this wasn't his A game. Maybe it really wasn't even about. Maybe this had been 10 years earlier, he would have been able to deliver something on the level of, Rebel or Johnny Guitar. A lot of praise goes to Big Rocha's score for the film. And it does have definitely some catchy, memorable themes. But again, it just kind of goes into the same bucket of nothing that really stands out, really burns itself into your mind. I should point out, going back to casting real quick, really nice touch, again, underused, but they cast Royal Dano, the great character actor, who is such a memorable face and voice. You know him. If you don't know him by name, you know who he is. Google him. Horror fans know him from Messiah of Evil. But just a terrific character actor. He's cast as Simon Peter, and it's a very interesting choice. It's very against the kind of the concept of Simon Peter. So Simon Peter was basically the leader of the 12 disciples. He was basically Jesus' right-handed man. And that choice to cast Dano in the role is definitely against type for that character. For example, a couple years before this, they had done a movie about Simon Peter called The Big Fisherman, and Howard Keel was cast into that role. And of course, Howard Keel was a famous musical star who was, the musical era was ending at that point. So even though Keel, when you think of a musical star, you don't think of Simon Peter, but Keel was a big guy. He was a big, brawny dude, and that definitely kind of fits in more with the way Simon Peter was presented. And Royal Dano, by contrast, was kind of like this, very thin, very gaunt, very slow, soft-spoken drawl. It's a really nice touch. He's a great character actor too. He's just a great actor. He had been in Johnny Guitar. I don't know if he did anything else with Nicholas Ray, but again, it's underused. They don't spend as much time with that character as you'd want to see. Actually, like there's really not a lot of time spent with the disciples. I mean, Simon Peter has a couple scenes. The character of John, who was the youngest of the disciples, he gets a couple of moments, and then of course Judas is the key one. But yeah, most of them only get one reference to their name, and that's it. So yeah, King of Kings. Again, when you think about all the talent that went into this film and the people who were in front of the camera, and again, having Nicholas Ray there, you want there to be so much more. And regardless of your, feelings one way or the other about Jesus or religion, the story of Jesus has a lot of potential just narratively. I mean, it's, there's just so many different directions you could take with that. And so for this film to kind of, again, it's not a bad film, but to just kind of come across, to land with such lifelessness, I guess, and to land with such ineffectiveness is unfortunate. Now, again, I am probably in the minority of opinion about this. Most people love this film. Like I said, it's considered one of the great biblical films. It has currently an 80%, I believe, on Rotten Tomatoes. It's got like a 7.0 on IMDb, which is pretty decent. But for me, it just, it does not hold a lot of weight. But I appreciate seeing it. I appreciate watching it. And I'm glad that my aunt enjoys watching it. So that will do it for this first installment on the works of Samuel Bronston. And next up will be El Cid, which I've never seen before. So definitely looking forward to checking that out. If you want to kind of follow along, King of Kings is out on Blu-ray, very affordable. I believe it's still in print, so feel free to pick that up. Unfortunately, some of these other Samuel Bronston films we'll be covering have not been widely released in the U.S. They've only had Blu-ray releases in other territories, but we shall deal with that as it comes. And just want to say thanks a lot for tuning back in. Again, sorry for the long delay in between episodes, and hopefully this will get us back to a more regular basis. So thanks for tuning in to Carbon City Cinema, and take care. We'll see you next week.